What is up, guys? Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to talk about sizing in CSS. We already know how to style some HTML elements. For example, let's start by styling the text in this paragraph. And we can do so by using the font size property and giving a value in pixels. It's useful to realize that this is just one way of specifying the sizing. There are actually many different ways of specifying a sizing in CSS. For example, we could give the font size a value of 2em. This means it's taking the value of font size from the parent and multiplying it by 2. Now, the term parent, it's one of those buzzwords in CSS where it's only obvious if you already know what it means. In HTML, we're probably familiar with the idea that some elements exist inside other elements. In fact, everything on a HTML document exists inside HTML tags. Now, when an element exists inside another element, the inside element is referred to as a child, and the outer element is referred to as the parent. So in this case, if the parent has a font size of 16 pixels, and the child has a font size of 2em, then the child has a font size of 32 pixels, twice the parent's font size. Now, if that's confusing, let's illustrate it by wrapping this paragraph in a div. This div element is going to be our parent in this case. The div is the parent. The paragraph, which is inside the div, is the child element. And let's style the div. So let's give the div a font size of 10 pixels. And let's type a little bit of text inside the div, but outside of the paragraph. Let's refresh. So we're seeing that the font inside the paragraph is twice the size of the font inside the div. Now, if we increase the font size of the div to 20 pixels, we'll see the same effect. So currently the font in the div is 20 pixels. So because the paragraph is 2em, it means it's twice as large as the font in the div. Now we can also make use of the value rem, and this stands for root element. And the root element in a HTML document is the HTML tag itself. Now, it's worth keeping in mind if we don't specify any font size here for the HTML tag, there is a default sizing that's applied by the browser. It's usually 16 pixels. So if we set the font size to 3 pixels, we can see that everything becomes very small. The text inside the div is now 3 pixels by default, but the text inside the paragraph is 6 pixels by default because it's 2 of the root element, and the root element is set to 3 pixels. Now, why would we choose to use em or rem instead of pixels? Well, the idea now is that we can actually change the font size of the entire page just by manipulating the font size of the root element. So imagine we had 10 different elements. They all had their font size as an rem multiple. Well, we could just come here and change one single value. And now everything on the page is going to be proportionally larger. So if we double the size of the root element, then we also double the size of all of the elements that use an rem value. So let's set the font size to something very small just to get it out of the way. We're now going to focus on these div elements, and they've each been given a different class: container 1, container 2, container 3. And what we're going to do is set a background color on these divs so that we can see them. So let's target with a div selector, and let's set the background color to red. Let's refresh the page. So at the moment, we can only see our div that contains the paragraph. So why can't we see any of the other 3 divs? It's because they don't currently have any height. Their initial height is set to 0. This is one of those problems that can easily hold you up for quite a period of time if you don't know the basics of CSS. We might wonder, well, why has the paragraph become visible? It's because the paragraph is given height by the text inside it. So as we add text to an element, it automatically increases its height. But by default, those div elements will have 0 height. So let's set those on the element. So we'll use a class selector in this case. Let's target container 1. Let's give it a width of 300 pixels, and let's give it a height of 300 pixels. So we should generate a square. Great, there we can see our square container, 300 pixels wide, 300 pixels high. And for now, I'm going to hide that paragraph by giving it a display of none. In fact, let's just remove the div we surrounded the paragraph with as well. So we're just left with our single container. Now let's think about some of the other values we can provide to width and height. Another way we can define these is by using a percentage. So let's see what happens if we set the width to 50%. So we can see it takes up exactly half of the space available, or 50% of its parent's width. So what is the parent? Well, in this case, it's simply the body tag. Now, if we're especially observant, we'll realize that this means that the body element by default is the width of the page. So as you might imagine, if we were to style the body and set the width of the body to 50%, well, now the width of our container is 25% overall. It's 50% of the 50% body. Let's now see what happens if we style the height with a percentage. Let's give it a height of 75%. And it just completely disappears. Now, this is one of those headaches that you can sometimes run into with CSS. Just said 75%. Did we maybe expect this container to now be 75% of the height of the page? Take a moment and think, what's going wrong here? Pause the video if you need to. Well, what is the height of the parent element? Because remember, it's always going to be 75% the size of that. Well, currently, since there's no paragraph or there's nothing in place here, the height of the parent element is actually 0. So what we have here is a red element, but we can't see it because its height is 75% of 0 pixels. So notice that quite a few of these elements have 0 height by default, but they actually have full width by default. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? We could, of course, just use a pixel value. We've seen that that works. But let's see if we can put this container 1 inside a parent element that has a height. So we'll make use of container 2 here. Let's define some styling for container 2. We'll give container 2 a height of 400 pixels and a width of 50%. Let's refresh the page. And let's give that a slightly different background color. Now notice this is technically a div, and we've already assigned red as the background color of the div. But this is going to have a higher degree of specificity. In other words, this particular rule is going to override the other one. Background color, blue. So we have two containers, one that's red and invisible at the moment because it has 0 height, and we have container 2. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put container 1 inside container 2 in our HTML. So now container 1 is going to have a height of 75% of the parent, which is container 2, the blue container, and that blue container has a height of 400 pixels. Let's refresh the page to see what happens. So we can see our red container width 50%, and it's 50% of the parent, so 25% of the total viewport in this case. And we can see it takes up 75% of the parent in terms of height. So we could actually do the same thing again. We could put container 3 inside container 1. Let's copy our container 1 class, and let's give this one a background color of yellow. So naturally we need to rename this to select container 3 instead of container 1. And if we scroll up, we just want to get rid of this second instance of container 3. Let's save the document, refresh the page, and there we can see our yellow container inside the red container. And once again, we can see it takes up 50% of the parent, the red container, and it takes up 75% of the height of the parent container. Now let's head back to container 2. We gave this an absolute height in pixels, but one of the issues we run into is not everyone's screen is the same size, right? Depending on whether someone's accessing our site on a tablet or a phone or a PC, could be a different sized screen. So setting the size of an element in pixels could be problematic because we don't know how large our user's screen or viewport is. So we can actually define the height of that parent element, the blue container, by using a different value, VH, which stands for viewport height. and it's a number between 1 and 100. So if we set 100 VH, it means 100% of the viewport height. So if we set this to 50 VH, it's going to take up half of the viewport. Or if we set it to 25 VH, it will take up 25% of the viewport. Notice that those child containers scale down proportionally with the parent container. Now we can also specify width with VW as well. So 50 VW stands for 50 viewport width. So it was already roughly 50 viewport width anyway. Let's set that to 75 viewport width. The advantage of this method is if we find that our user has a different sized viewport, we can kind of simulate this by opening the DevTools. Imagine I had a really narrow screen. I mean, this is unrealistically narrow. No one has a screen like this. But notice it's taking 75% of the screen width. As the viewport gets larger, the size of that blue container scales up proportionally. Whereas if I were to just set a width, such as 600 pixels, that's going to look fine on a wide viewport. But then if someone accesses our page on a narrow screen, now there's a problem. This blue container is staying the same size regardless of the size of the user screen. So there are some advantages to using VH instead, because it naturally scales based on the size of the user screen. This is a concept referred to as responsive design, and we're going to revisit this later in the course. It's a very important concept with CSS. Okay, so key takeaways here: how to use the height and width properties on an element, and also the different values we can use for styling, sizing, along with their associated pros and cons. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.